Hello, good morning. My name is Mariana Buquerque. I'm a senior fellow here at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, CEBRI, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all today to the online event Brazil-US Bicentennial, Past, Present, and Future, in partnership with the Wilson Center Brazil Institute. I am here today replacing Professor Fernanda Manhota, who unfortunately couldn't join us due to some health issues. I wish my dear friend Fernanda a quick recovery, and I know she will be back sooner than later. This event is a celebratory moment, as it is based on a book organized by Professor Fernanda Manhota and published by Alexandre de Gusmão Foundation, FUNAG. The book was officially launched in May this year in a ceremony at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brasilia. And the book, which goes by the same title of our event today, has 25 chapters written by academics, diplomats, and it is divided into three main sections: past, present, and future of the Brazil-US relations. The foreword of the book was written by Minister Mauro Vieira, and it was published in both English and Portuguese and remains available at the FUNAG website. Today, we have the honor to welcome here 4 people who have directly contributed to the book and will be sharing their considerations in a personal capacity. So welcome first, Professor Cristina Pesequilo. She is a professor of international politics at the Federal University of São Paulo, Unifesp. Eduardo Freitas, who is the head of the division for US and Canada at the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Professor Maria Hermínia Tavares de Almeida, also a senior fellow here at CEBRI and a professor of political science at the University of São Paulo, USP. And last but not least, Bruna Santos, director of the Wilson Center Brazil Institute, to which I say a great thank you for the partnership in this event today. And first, I will pass the floor to Professor Cristina Pesequilo, who will share her considerations on the chapter she has written. Please, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, CEBRI, for the invitation to participate in this event. And also, it's a pleasure to share the morning with all the dear colleagues that are present and will follow with their talks after me. And also the Woodrow Wilson Center, Professor Manhota, for the invitation also to contribute with the book, and FUNAG, who edited the book. So we are here in a very pleasant morning, and in Brazil, it's morning, and it's a very good place to start and to try to debate the issues. My contribution to the book was written regarding Lula's government. So I can say that we're talking about the present, a little bit about the past, and a lot about the future. And this is what I'll be sharing with you this morning. The title of the chapter is US and Brazil in Lula's government, 2003 to 2010 and 2023 current, thinking about a partnership. So my first thoughts when I opened the chapter, and I'm going to share this with you, some points. I'm not going to go deeper so that you feel compelled to read the book. The book is in English and in Portuguese, so please download the book at FUNAG, because it's very important for us to share these thoughts and to try to demystify a little bit of Brazil-US relations in a sense. So what we're talking about here, we are talking about a relation that should be understood as a structure in the history of Brazilian foreign policy. Even though some people say that Brazilian foreign policy has some problems, has some issues, we should say that it's a very strong foreign policy. It's a very clear foreign policy in relation to its main partners and also to its idea of who Brazil is in some times. So the idea that Brazil and US is a bilateral relation that is a structure means that we're talking about a relation that affects our patterns of foreign policy and also affect our historical paradigms. So we can always start saying that we are very good partners. I think that this is one of the most resilient features of Brazilian foreign policy, how to understand these relations and its oscillations during time. But nevertheless, it's a very important relation, if not our most important relation so far, despite other partners that are developing in the world. So the first consideration is that Brazil and the US bilateral relations are structured, but then we should also qualify these relations. They are asymmetrical relations because although we are equal in many values, in many thoughts, we share the same ideas about the world, about peace and so on, we are not equal poles. So these are asymmetric relations, and we are different as we are a country from the geopolitical south, Brazil, namely, and also the US, who is the leader of the international system. So this asymmetric relation has some problems, and it will have as any other relation between powers. These realities, they come to be more evident during periods where Brazilian politics is very fragmented inside, and also when we have a very important reality of transition in world power. So I'm thinking about the world, the region, and also the instabilities in Brazil. So these are a little bit of the first thoughts that I present in the chapter. And one may say that Lula's government is one of the most studied in the current history of Brazil-US relations due to its fragmentations, contradictions, oscillations, but it's also one of the most important because it reveals a changing pattern of the relation, especially because Brazil changed its relative position in the world. So what we're talking about here, in the text, I divide of the chapter two periods, Lula 1 and 2, and I call this the changing patterns of relation, which is very complex. So from 2003 to 2010, we lived in the beginning of the 21st century, a series of changes in the relations that are related to what? To new balances of power and coalitions of variable design from the North and from the South. So Brazil, as a member of the geopolitical South, whereas it began the first decade of the 21st century, had some changes in its political agenda, its social agenda, but trying to replace some of the myths of the Cold War, post-Cold War world, that alignment was the best policy, that Brazil was not a very good country, that Brazil was not very strong. So when Lula came first into power, we had a very stabilizing government before, which was Fernando Henrique Cardoso, which pavimented the ways to Lula to have his government in a more favorable situation than the one that Fernando Henrique took power in 1995. So what we're talking about here is the change in Brazilian foreign policy in a changing world also. So geopoliticals and geoeconomics were changing as the geopolitical South was rising, and also these coalitions of variable design such as IPSA and the BRICS mainly. So what was the problem for Brazil and the US bilateral relations? And we may not call it a problem. I think I call it as a question, how to adapt to each partner different agendas and power status. So that Brazil was growing, the US was facing challenges from its other partners, such as China, in this rebalance of power. And then it's natural that power clashes are going to happen between the two countries. Some say that Brazil went too far in this government. I disagree. I think that the problem was that we lacked at the time current mechanisms of building confidence in the relation, and we're still working on it. So natural clashes of power relations were put into a framework that was very exaggerated because, as I said in the beginning, this is a structural relation for the Brazilian foreign policy. So my idea in this part of the text was how to discuss this idea of convergences within divergences and divergences within convergences. This is not a mere playing games with words, but to show that even though Brazil and the US disagreed in very important geopolitical issues, and I would name one that everybody will remember, which is the nuclear deal with Iran and Turkey, most of the time they had convergences in South America and so on. But most of the time also these convergences and these divergences were affected by what? By Brazil's own fragmentation and polarization in politics, and the shadow of the economic crisis of 2008 and other problems that were happening in the world, such as the global war on terror. In the text, I go deeper into these issues, but in this presentations, I would only like to point some issues so that you feel compelled also to read the chapter, and of course the whole book, which is very interesting. So coming to an end with these points that I would like to highlight for you, we come to Lula 3 at the middle of the road, 2 years of government, and now we can think, how is the relationship now and the future ahead? The first consideration is that Brazil and the US endured a decade of changes before that. So sometimes we tend to argue that there is a pattern of continuity between Lula 1 and 2 and Lula 3, but the world, the region, and Brazil and the US are very different from a decade ago. So we cannot forget there was a decade between these 3 governments. It's important to remember that, and once more to try to depolarize the debate regarding Brazilian foreign policy. So after this decade of general changes, Brazil was enduring a very important crisis when Lula came into power in 2023. Brazil is back was the very important slogan that was being talked all around the world, and the world was expecting Brazil to be back. And this is the time when Brazil came into power with Joe Biden in the Democratic venue, holding the White House. And of course, this is a most favorable moment for values and principles to be convergent in our agenda. There are a lot of crises in both Brazil and the United States that, again, I'm not going to go deeper in them, but we should understand that the changing political environment in both nations brings more challenges for the relation. But Brazil is different. He's trying to regain some of the credibility he lost in the years before Lula 3, but also we must remember that we have endured economic crisis, a pandemic with COVID-19, the growing polarization of the right and left, the lack of project of sometimes progressive forces to understand how the far right is gaining ground in the world. So this changing political environment is very, very challenging for both countries. And again, asymmetric relations, but similar challenges and similar values and similar projects. So how to overcome these dilemmas that are involving geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geoculture as also. So how to overcome this? First of all, we must remember that we are partners. We're never going to be enemies. This is very important to make clear for all our audience, because sometimes it's kind of shadowy to say these things because of all the political polarization, but we are really partners as usual. Convergences, divergences, these are the normal facts of life. Brazil and the US are powers, and the normal facts of life should be understanding like this. I think that in the shadow of US presidential elections in 2014, what we should say? I think that we should say that one of the most important dilemmas of our time is how to overcome the dilemma of state policies and governmental policies. I remember one interview by Mauro Vieira to Metrópolis Journal, which is a journal from Brasilia, when he says that no matter what government is in the US or in Brazil, good relations are always going to be a priority. I agree totally with Ambassador Minister Vieira, but also say that this is a dilemma that Brazilian foreign policy should overcome in its polarization and its political debate. So the future ahead, I think it's bright for us. Brazil has other partners, but none is still more important than the US, especially in terms of democracy, policy, and values. So this is really a brief presentation just to, as I said, invite you to read the chapter and invite you to read the book. I once more thank you, CEBRI, thank you, FUNAG, thank you all of the people involved in this event, and apologize, I had some mistakes in talking in English here because I had prepared the presentation in Portuguese, but then oh my God, it's in English, so I apologize for that. And I think that this election in the US is very important for Brazil. But as I said, state policy overcomes governmental policies, and our history together is a history of both countries that are equal, but different in their own sense. So I thank you for this moment, and I end my presentation.
Thank you, Professor Cristina. You did a great job in stimulating the audience in reading your chapter. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I personally liked how you structure your presentation, mentioning that there are three main features of the Brazil-US relations. They are structural relations, strategic relations, but also asymmetrical relations, and how we cope and navigate between those three characteristics are going to make the difference by the end of the day. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I will invite now to share their thoughts with us as well, Mr. Eduardo Freitas, head of the division for US and Canada at the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I will benefit from the fact that I am mentioning the ministry now to thank again FUNAG for the partnership in the book and in this event. So Eduardo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mariana. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so let me start by thanking FUNAG, CEBRI, and the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute for the invite to be here today in such great company. It's a pleasure. Good morning, everyone. So when I was invited to join the project and write an article for the book, specifically on the future of Brazil-US relationship, it occurred to me that I would have to do so not knowing who the US president is going to be starting in January, what the next administration is going to look like. And then that I would have to find a way or an angle to try and look beyond the current political cycle and even the political divide in American politics. And then I thought it could be useful in this context to try and look to what I see as the shifting dynamics of the broader political consensus on foreign policy in the United States, the kinds of positions or topics that seem to be gaining ground among both Democrats and Republicans. And then try to assess their possible impacts for Brazil and our relations with the US. So I'll have to, in doing that, I'll have to point out a few convergences, if you may, between Republicans and Democrats and the Trump and Biden administrations. I do not want to imply in any way that they are similar or to equate both, which would be very foolish of me. The differences are plain for everyone to see in the electoral race, but the point is precisely that even in times of deep political polarization, there is still a broader framework within which both parties position themselves and try and operate. And what I think is interesting is that this framework has been in flux for the last 10 to 15 years. I think so. Starting then with what came before that time, so from roughly the 1980s to the 90s, was the period we could call the neoliberal political order, is the term I use in the article, based on the work of American historian, political scientist Gary Gerstle. So globalization was the order of the day. There was a big boom in international trade, international investment flows. It also coincided, in most part, with the unipolar moment of the United States, as the sole superpower, and also the main pillar of an international order, which was also based on liberal values, and in which international trade played a vital role. Relations with China also benefited from the general optimism of the time. They were unburdened by the geostrategic concerns that would come later and that came before as well. There was, of course, already points of tension between both countries, but Beijing was not yet seen as a major threat or a competitor. And there was much promise and much expectation on the possibilities and opportunities for economic integration, and also the belief that integrating China into the world economy would somehow lead to further economic and political reforms. And then we fast forward to the Obama administration, and already things look different. It was already clear by then that China was destined to become a superpower. Already in 2009, 2010, it became the world's largest exporter, the world's second largest economy. US strategy for the Indo-Pacific was then reconceived in a way to try and deal with the task of containing China. But it was still a strategy based on a more positive assessment of international trade and economic integration, anchored in this idea of a Trans-Pacific partnership, which was, of course, abandoned by the Trump administration in its first week, right? So this is when things escalated more quickly. China was brought to the center of foreign policy, and economic policy as well. It was labeled very clearly as a strategic competitor, accused of stealing jobs and investments from the United States. The Trump administration also resorted to an important surge in tariffs on Chinese imports in what became known as the trade war. And there were other measures as well, like economic measures taken with geostrategic and national security interests in mind, controlling Chinese investments in the United States, for instance. And this approach, I think, was in its, at least in its broad outlines, was followed by the Biden administration. There are, of course, differences in implementation. I think there is a more clear emphasis on keeping communication channels open and cooperating whenever possible. There's also the recognition that decoupling would be unfeasible. Disastrous for both countries were the words used by Secretary Allen. But all in all, it's still all about strategic competition. The trade war tariffs were not revoked. Other economic measures were taken against China, like export controls and also outbound investment controls. So there's the way I see it, a continuity in essence. And well, for brevity, I had to emphasize a little bit more the role of China, but it was not the only contributing factor to these developments. So I think there were already even in mainstream economics critiques to globalization effects on some groups, including U.S. industries and U.S. industrial workers, and of course the the justification, political justification for these changes was the idea of bringing back investments, jobs, revitalizing the American industry. There was also the COVID-19 pandemic, which raised awareness about the importance of diversifying suppliers, building more resilient supply chains, and then behind that, the idea of a reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, which were all very much in vogue in the last few years. The same reasons and justifications were behind a second phenomenon, which we could witness in the Biden administration, which was the return to industrial policy strategies in the United States. There were, we know, major investment packages like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act approved during the Biden administration. And I think it's not yet clear if a Republican administration would also pursue industrial policies. But we know that Republicans oppose the IRA, for instance. But it looks to me like it was much more about the IRA's focus on climate than an issue or a problem with industrial policy itself. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. And this uncertainty also serves to highlight the fact that this post-neoliberal order, if you may, is not yet fully formed. There are moving parts. We're not sure yet what its precise outline is going to look like. It's a transition period, I think, much like the 1970s, where it transitioned from the New Deal order to the neoliberal one. But I guess there's enough material for us to try and look at these macro trends and assess what kind of impact they could have for Brazil and for our bilateral relations with the US. So for one, of course, US industrial policy and trade barriers are a point of concern for foreign countries. European and Asian countries were quick to voice their own concerns after the IRA was approved, for instance. It could be seen as competing for the same kind of productive investments. So the fact that the United States is approving like major subsidies, loans, and grants is, of course, affects the kind of balance that underpins this competition. But for Brazil, I think things are a bit more nuanced and might play out differently, simply for the fact that we were not able to take a greater part in the global value chains when they were first formed. And the current redesigning might actually be a new opportunity for us to try and attract investments and integrate more deeply into those chains. Those opportunities are, of course, enhanced by the fact that our own economic policy is also geared towards boosting our industrial capacity, especially in strategic sectors. You know, the Lula administration launched its own industrial policy strategy in January, Nova Indústria Brasil. There are various programs aimed at specific sectors, sustainable mobility, the medical industrial complex, semiconductors, of course, possible synergies between the IRA and Brazil's ecological transition plan, which is something that our finance ministry has been trying to work on with Treasury and the Office of the SPEC. On the challenges, so just to be clear, the way I see it, there are challenges and opportunities. So this was the opportunities part. There's more to it if you read the article. And of course, I try at least to draw a more complete pictures of how I see these developments unfolding. But then on the challenges, I think the main one would be being caught in the crossfire of US-China tensions, which is something Professor Pesekilo already mentioned. certainly one of the main challenges for our diplomacy in the years ahead will be to chart a path that allows us to navigate these tensions in a way that is consistent with our foreign policy principles of independence, universalism, pragmatism, which is, of course, a task we are already hard at work at for some years, along with many countries in the global south and beyond. And a last point I would make is about the background to these developments, which is often described as a new Cold War, which I think is a misleading description. I would tend to agree with other experts which point out that the current international order is much more fragmented and multipolar. There's more space for flexibility and autonomy, and the sort that would call not for a revival of a Cold War style non-alignment, but something more like a multi-alignment or an active non-alignment, as some call it, which seeks to deepen cooperation and dialogue with both the US and China and other actors and explore every possible alternative to further our development goals. There is a quote I retrieved from my article, if I may, it goes like this, it's not too long. It is only natural that countries aligned neither with the United States nor China will seek to engage with both, seeking to benefit from the competition while endeavoring to protect their own interests from any spillover effects. I think it captures very well the spirit of what I'm trying to convey. And this, by the way, is not a Brazilian diplomat or policymaker, but National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, which seems to indicate to me that US authorities are also aware of the kind of logic that is behind our own diplomatic approach and other countries as well. So I will just end at this positive note of mutual understanding, just hoping that in the years ahead, we might further deepen our cooperation and tend to many shared interests, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. You also made a great job in stimulating people to reading your chapters. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. And one of the arguments that you brought that I think is very interesting is how bilateral relations are not only affected by the endogenous conditions of the two partners, but also by the systemic reassessments and reshapings. And then the rise of China is one of these undeniable factors that both the US and Brazil have to take into account when building their own relations. So thank you for bringing this systemic overview of the process as well. It was great hearing you. And now I will invite Professor Maria Hermínia to also share with us her comments, which are always great. And Professor Maria Hermínia, you have the floor. I think you have a presentation, right? We are already sharing it for you. You are muted, Professor. You have to turn your mic on.
Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity. I would like to thank CEBRI, the Wilson Center, and FUNAG for this invitation, and say that I'm very pleased to be here with my colleagues, Cristina, Eduardo, and Bruna. What I'm going to do today is to share some findings of the chapter that I have written with my colleague Ivan Felipe Fernandes, and that are in this book, about which the former colleagues have speak a little bit about, and I think it's really worthwhile to have it and to read it. The next table, please. Relations between Brazil and the United States are very complex. And I would say, as far as we are talking about state-to-state relations, it's a kind of game in three boards. The bilateral one, and there we have a very good understanding among the two countries, a mature and long-lasting cooperation around shared interests. We have some differences in trade, but our cooperation is really good, stable, and mature. The other chessboard is the regional. And for the region, I'm thinking here in Latin America, but especially in South America. Here also, we have a lot of shared goals: peace, democracy, security, fighting transnational crime, drug trafficking, organized crime, etc. But sometimes we have different strategies regarding the problems and the crises in the region. And I think that the present Venezuelan crisis is an example. We converge around the goal of stability and democracy. We have different views about how to deal with the crisis. And finally, the third chessboard is the multilateral arena. And there we also have shared goals, but we have different commitments to multilateral principles. Brazil is much more multilateralist and much more consistently multilateralist than the United States, and sometimes different behavior inside the international organizations. Also, as Eduardo has stressed, we have also different attitudes regarding international conflicts, and especially regarding the emerging China. But what I show, please, the next plate. But relations between Brazil and the United States are not only relations between the two states. There's a very, very strong stream of flux of relations in economic sphere, investment, trade, and very strong societal relations, tourism, strong societal networks of academics in the cultural area, whatever, of students. And this creates strong ties between the two countries. And also we have a very strong influence of the American mass culture. And therefore, the images of the Brazilians about the United States are quite independent of the ups and downs of the diplomatic relations. They are a kind of societal base for the perceptions of the Brazilians about the United States. First, I would like to show some comparative data. Those are data of the Pew Research Center. No, please. Next, yes. And no, the form, yeah, okay, thank you. As you can see, Brazilians are among the people that has a more positive view about the United States, much more positive than UK, than Germans, than Canadians. So we are in the group of countries where the public opinion is quite favorable to the United States. And this sometimes we lose the perception of this, and I think it's important to have it in a comparative framework. Please, the next plate. The next 4 plates that I show are based in the project Ivan and I have in Brazil, called Brazil, the Americas and the World. It's a cooperation with CEBRI Mexico, which has a comparative project called the Americas and the World. We have a survey with the public, panel survey that repeats itself each 4 years. And those are the answers to a question about a positive or negative view about the United States. As you can see, public opinion has a strong positive view of the United States. There are differences between those in the left. There are the PT voters or Workers' Party voters. On the right, which are the vertical lines, and others that have no party allegiance at all. But anyway, the gray line, which is the total of Brazilians, you can see it's around more up to 7%, around between 7 and 8% of positive views of the United States. The next plate, please. When you change a little bit the question and ask about trust, the answers are not that positive, but anyway, are quite positive also. It's around 50% of Brazilians have a positive thing, that have a positive answer to the question, do you trust or not trust the United States? The same, but please next plate. This is a question about the role of the United States in keeping peace in the world. Here, Brazilians are more skeptical, but anyway, it's around 40%, 45% of the Brazilians think that the United States have a positive role in keeping peace in the world. The last plate I want to show you is a comparison between opinions about US and China regarding, it's the same, the first one is the same table I have already shown. It's about trust in the United States, but as you comparing to the Brazilians' opinions about China, Brazilians have a much more positive answer to the trust question regarding the United States than regarding China. Please, I will conclude here. Please, the next plate. I will say that there's obviously previous and very positive bilateral diplomatic relations, and there is a strong societal support for positive bilateral relations, despite partisan and political preferences or differences regarding regional and global issues, and also regarding China. This is obvious for us here, but maybe not for some foreign public. You cannot expect automatic alignment on regional and global issues, and this is an issue in our relations. But you can deep in a very positive way, bilateral cooperation. And this, I think, will depend not only on, and there's a public opinion support for this, but this depends not only on the wish of the public, on the wish of Brazilian government, but I think it will also depend on the capacity of the United States to offer new opportunities of cooperation, and to understand that this happens in a new context of an important China presence in the region. For the first time, United States will have to think its relations to Latin America or to South America in a situation that its main competitor is here and is aggressively here in terms of trade and investments. But I think we have a very positive opportunity to strengthen bilateral relations, to cooperate at regional issues and also at the multilateral level, but it also will depend not only on the Brazilian capacity or in Brazilian desire, or on the Brazilians' desire to strengthen this relation, but also on active policies on both sides. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Maria Hermínia. Always a pleasure learning from you. And you brought two variables to the equation, which are also a huge part of the Brazil-US relations, which are the role of the public opinion and the region. Venezuela is now the main challenge, but we had others in the past. And it's very interesting to see how Brazil and the US also reorganize the bilateral relations, considering the geography, right? Geography is an undeniable factor of international relations. And by passing the floor from you to Bruna, who will be our last speaker, I would just would like to make a reference that this book assembles different generations of Brazil experts who devoted their lives to study the US. So this book is also a tribute to all of you who have been, by your academic work, heavily contributing to make the US and Brazil relations based on knowledge, based on science, based on method. And it is something that I didn't want to miss the opportunity to highlight. So this book is brilliantly organized by Professor Fernanda, but it's a collective effort and you all deserve a part of it. So now, Bruna, you have the floor, please. And thank you again for the Wilson Center Brazil Institute for the partnership.
Of course, Mariana, thank you. Thanks again for CEBRI, for FUNAG, obviously Fernanda, you. I'm in a easy but also very difficult position here to speak after so many brilliant minds. What a brilliant presentation Maria Hermínia just did, which gives me, like, as we say in Portuguese, eu voto com relator, I vote with the rapporteur. So I vote with the rapporteurs here. It was really fascinating. And I want to also reinforce your remarks, Mariana. I think Fernanda did a brilliant job in weaving this patchwork of generations, of visions, analyzing the past, looking at the present, delineating the future, about this consequential relationship between Brazil and the US, and the minds that are behind this book is really fascinating. For those who don't know me and the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center, let me just briefly tell you that we are the only think tank exclusively focusing in Brazil here in the United States, which gives us the position to somehow very often interpret Brazil and its dynamics to the foreign world. And obviously, I will always recommend this book from now on whenever people are trying to understand Brazil's foreign policy and dynamic. But very often what I do here in Washington is also recommending people to read Machado de Assis, because I think that one of the lenses that you need to understand Brazil is going beyond the archetypes of villain and hero, enemy and friend, to understand the world in a more nuanced way, in a more with different and sometimes contradictions and contradictory nature of our decisions. So that's just, I think one thing that I note is there is the need today in the world to step aside from telling what people think Brazil's foreign policy should be and dedicating some time to understand what it really is and why it is this way. And this book is definitely a source for that understanding. So yeah, read it, download it, and please make from this a source of understanding of Brazil and delineated more sophisticated an analysis about this relationship. As someone said here, I think one of the things we hear very often, and it's true, is that Brazil and the US are good friends, are not enemies and not allies. So I think that the Brazilian-US relations, as we have seen in this presentations, have their ups and downs, but is grounded in social and economic affinities that have their periods of closeness, of distance. But more recently, we have seen a very close approach, especially when it comes to the bilateral relation between Brazil and the US, between Biden and Lula. We see that the relationship has been affected by change in the global order, by the decline of multilateralism, by the resurgence of geopolitics as a central element that affects not only trade, but also investment flows, and obviously by the competition between China and the United States. But this period that coincides with Lula and Biden presidencies, I think it's very unique that we see Brazil and the United States strengthening convergence around fundamental values of the defense of democracy, which is highlighted in both countries' electoral campaigns, including the platform of Lula's government when he got elected and suffered with January 8th. The same thing happened with Biden when he got elected and suffered with January 6th here. And the region also has witnessed Brazil as an important mobilizer in defending democratic institutions and defending the respect of electoral results. So it's also, I think, important to know the opportunities that are presented by the fact that we have a foundational characteristic of our societies that I believe need to be brought to the center of the bilateral relationship, which is inequality born and solidified from an undeniable past of slavery. This is one of the things that I think are in the legacy of Brazil's and the US histories that we often neglect to talk about, and that is the source of our inequality in both countries. And the pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis have exacerbated those social inequalities and highlighted the effects of the structural racism. And though this is one of the topics that we have seen brought again to the agenda of the bilateral relationship between Lula and Biden. Another clear point of convergence that is needed to mention is that we see civil society, we see companies, part of the government, obviously not everyone, bringing to the center of the bilateral relation the commitment to combat climate change and to meet the commitments of the Paris Agreement. Of course, things might change depending on the election, depending on a number of different variables, but this is one important element of convergence today. Also, when you look at both countries promoting green development through their industrial policies, IRA was mentioned here, the Inflation Reduction Act, Brazil's green transformation plan. I'm sorry if I'm translating wrongly the name of the policy, but those policies, they are attentive to the necessary green transition, and they are also steering development towards a more greener agenda, let's put it this way. So even though, what I mean by saying that is that even though there are differences in external agendas, there is convergence in many aspects in the bilateral and regional agenda. There is a coincidence. Another thing I want to mention, and I often use that image, is that Brazil and the US are countries looking at each other in the mirror in many aspects. The relationship has an important role in the 21st century, which is showing the world that democracies can deliver goods. And not just as democracies not only deliver the moral values of it, like freedom of expression, but also lifting people out of poverty, delivering infrastructure, jobs, income, those things that make people defend democracy as a regime that can deliver goods is something that Brazil and the US can show the world. I always say that if you look at the 20th century, the largest infrastructure projects were in democratic countries. If you look at the most important infrastructure projects in the 21st century, they are in autocracy. So Brazil and the US have this, I think, importance in the region and in the world. To achieve that, I think it's worth noting a couple things. One is that today in the region, the US is a partner by choice. As some of you have shared, it's a choice for autonomy. It's no longer a matter of automatic alliance between two poles. Two is, it's important to know that together, Brazil and the US produce 25% of the world's food. And both countries have been, as we have seen over the past years, committing to work on initiatives that make agriculture much more sustainable. There are many projects around biotechnology, investing in, both countries are invested in replacing chemical fertilizers, bioinputs. So all that, I think, generate a whole framework, a whole new space for cooperation. And these partnerships are reinforce the ongoing collaboration between the two countries, but there is obviously a space for us to strengthen that. And by that, I mean mechanisms that were created within the IRA, for example, that could be enhanced to enable Brazil and Argentina to also be part of this, of the value chain of electric cars and others, that could address the main problem of that the IRA tried to address, which is the vulnerability of supply chain and the fact that it can be used as an industrial policy to address the climate issues. So I think that the multiple coincidences that establish the foundation of this bilateral relationship are important to be brought into consideration. And also, I would highlight another element, which is the importance of Brazil and the US to cooperate in the field of advanced technologies. I think one of the things that we've been looking at and seeing a lot of interest between in the relationship is how Brazil and the US can cooperate in the field of artificial intelligence, especially remembering that both artificial intelligence and the energy transition are related, because without the cloud technology, there's no artificial intelligence. Without data centers, there's no cloud. And without a lot of clean energy, you don't have artificial intelligence that dialogues with a greener future. So Brazil, with more than 80% of its energy matrix coming from clean sources, it's an important player in the region for that. Not to mention, and I've heard some of you mentioning the points of convergence and divergence around the multilateral agenda on topics of common interest and topics that are not so much of common interest. But I think climate and trade are points of a lot of common interest in the multilateral agenda. There should be more periodic evaluation around that agenda moving forward. So one of the things that just to wrap up, that I think is very important for us to note is as Maria Hermínia brought up, is the role of our societies and economies and how they are increasingly intertwined, and that how they are shaping this new bilateral agenda in a world where we see Brazil and the US learning to deal with the uncertainties and the instabilities in a more stable and mature way. I think we are in a learning process of understanding this new moment in history. And I think the US is also understanding how Brazil is delineating its strategy by understanding that both we are in an era of multipolar, but also we are in an era where you see two very fragile powers such as China and the United States, who have their own fragility. So you have a lot of uncertainty, you have a lot of instability, and you are learning how to deal with that in a more stable and mature way. And I think this evolution, it reflects a more open and less prejudiced approach to the international relations, which means that we are figuring out where there is consensus and where cooperation becomes a natural evolution of that consensus, and where there are differences that we need to express and respect and just dialogue and seek solutions. I think that's one of the main messages from moving forward. And then I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Bruna. It was also great to hear from you how we can look at the glass half full when we consider the US and Brazil relations and focus on the convergences. And also congratulations on the amazing work that the Wilson Center does in fostering those people-to-people relations, which we all know that is the foundation for anything that happens internationally. So I have a round of questions, one question for each one of you. And I would like to start with Eduardo Freitas. Brazil this year is hosting G20, and we know that in 2026, it will be the US who will be the G20 president, which means that next year we will be together in the Troika, right? So my question to you is around the US G20 presidency. If you already know anything that the US plans to prioritize on that forum, and if you think the result of the elections can generate a major shift in that priorities in case we have Trump back again.
Well, thank you, Mariana. You're right that the United States will be the president of the G20 in 2 years' time, so we'll be together in the Troika next year. We don't have yet a clear idea of what sort of priorities they are going to promote, but what we know is that they have been very supportive of our own priorities throughout the year. There are three. One is a reform of global governance, then sustainable development in its three pillars, right? So economic, social, and environmental. And then combating hunger and poverty. This has been all of these issues have been discussed with our U.S. partners. They have been supportive of all of them, and I think there's real convergence, I think, in those agendas, and especially on the agenda of global governance reform. I think the U.S. position has evolved in the last few years. It's more explicitly in favor of those kinds of reforms. So we look forward to, we appreciate their support, of course, which is important for our G20 presidency to achieve its objectives. And we look forward to continue our dialogue with them on those. On the impact of the U.S. election, I would think so, right? So it's normal that the G20 president will try to translate into its priorities what its own domestic priorities are. So the position of the party itself, I think, plays a role. Our own priorities kind of speak to that. So I think that this is what the main reason that it's hard to try and guess what sort of agenda to try to push in 2026. I guess we'll have to wait a little bit more.
I extend you an invitation to come back and share those priorities with us as soon as they are launched, but thank you. I will now direct the second question to Professor Cristina Pesequilo. And this question addressed a little bit of the elephant in the room, which is the US-Israel relations and how the unconditional support of the US, historical unconditional support from the US to Israel can or not make an impact in the US-Brazil relations. So how do you see those two words combining?
Thank you, Mariana, and thank you, the audience, for the question. I think this is one of the most sensitive issues in the history of Brazil-US relations, and not only now, because of the ongoing conflict on Israel, and Palestinians and Hamas and so on. So I think that this is an issue that is affected by both countries' geopolitical interests. And I will bring back something that Eduardo brought in his presentation. Brazilian foreign policy, and it was also present in mine, Brazilian foreign policy has its own set of values and principles regarding South-South relations and also the world in general. So this is very well known that Brazil was not going to choose sides in many conflicts. And this is not a bad thing because Brazil has this kind of balancing position and tries to moderate. This is the nature of Brazilian foreign policy and the attention to international law and the attention to multilateralism. So this is going to be also a clashing issue in both relations, Brazil and US relations, and also Brazil and Israel relations, if we say that, because as I said, it's a historical position of Brazilian foreign policy. So how this affects bilateral relations? Of course, it will bring some clashes, as I said. These are facts of life. These are two powers that operate in different settings of power, and values are the same towards democracy and so on in general, but this is an issue of contention. And we saw that Brazil also during this conflict from 2023 till now is trying to moderate, especially when it was ahead of the Brazilian of the UN Security Council. So it's going to be natural to have these positions that are not convergent. So I think this is normal. And also we can also have to pinpoint that the lack of, as I said, confidence building measures sometimes in Brazil-US relations in these contentious issues may bring some tensions. So I think that this is an issue of accommodation, but as the last mentioned, I would say that sometimes the noises in the public opinion, in the media, and sometimes in the political parties and so on are higher than they are in the diplomatic field. Why? Because this represents interest groups in both nations, and these nations are polarized and groups of interest, and politicians are trying to get elected and to please their own bases. So this will affect sometimes not only bilateral relations, but also the internal domestic politics of each country. But I think that we can have a framework in which these relations and these disagreements are going to be normal, understood as normal, because they are normal, and Brazil is not going to get back from its positions, and the US is not going to go back on its positions. It's geopolitical, and in this sense, it also shows social and cultural issue. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Cristina. And I think accommodation is the key word that you mentioned, right? To Professor Maria Hermínia, I have a challenge for you, which Fernanda Manhota asked me to direct this question. If you were to summarize the Brazil-US relations in one word, which word would you pick? Your mic is still off, Professor.
I would say, can I say two words? Open possibilities? Because I think there are lots of open possibilities that can be explored by, I would say, good, intelligent foreign policies on both sides.
Amazing. With these two words, we cannot go wrong, right?
Okay.
And to Bruna.
Yes,
and
I need an adjective besides a substantive.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you. And to Bruna, and this will be the last comment of our panel. So I thank everyone in advance for the participation and also for the audience who stick with us until the end. Bruna, you mentioned that you always recommend Machado de Assis for the US audience to understand Brazil. But if you need to go the other way around, which book would you recommend to the Brazilian audience for them to understand the US? Besides the one we are launching here today, right?
Historically, I would say, the first thing that came to my mind, okay? Why are we polarized, Ezra Klein? It's to understand the recent US more recently. And, oh yeah, just one, I promise. No, you asked for one, there's one.
Thank you, Bruna. And the same question that I asked Professor Maria Hermínia, if you need to summarize the Brazil-US relations in one word, which word?
Choice. Escolha.
Professor Cristina, if you need to summarize the relation in one word, which word would you pick?
Structural.
Eduardo, now for you.
Ooh, this is hard. I think I would go back to someone mentioned that already, but partnership. Something in between. It's still very close, but not allies, but certainly not enemies, and partners for sure.
Okay, so we have partnership, choices, open possibilities, and structural. So I think these 4 words are a good summary of how the US relations were in the past, are in the present, and can be in the future. So with that end note, I thank you all again for your participation, and thank you also again for the Wilson Center, FUNAG, and CEBRI for convening this amazing debate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.